The room was designed for luxury, not survival. Thick carpets, polished wood, soft lighting meant to make powerful men feel comfortable. But on that night, comfort didn't exist. Inside a private hotel suite high above New York City, the air was heavy with cigar smoke and something sharper anticipation. 12 men sat around a long table, every one of them armed, every one of them capable of ordering death with a word. This was the Mafia Commission, and this room was full of killers. No one raised their voice at first. That was how dangerous rooms worked. Calm on the surface, violence waiting just underneath. Glasses of whiskey sat untouched, cigars burned down slowly, eyes studied faces, measuring loyalty, resentment, fear. These men had fought wars, survived betrayals, buried rivals. They didn't need threats to understand what was possible here. Lucky Luciano sat among them, relaxed, almost detached. He wasn't the boss. That was the point. The commission had no boss. It was his idea. A system built to stop endless bloodshed, to replace impulsive violence with rules and votes. For most men in the room, that system meant survival. For at least one, it felt like a cage. Something was wrong, and everyone could feel it. A few chairs shifted. A few glances lingered longer than they should have. This meeting wasn't routine. It had been called for a reason, and that reason was heavy enough to bend the mood of the room. Outside, the city moved on like nothing was happening. Inside, the future of organized crime was being weighed. Lucky noticed the tension immediately. He had learned long ago that danger announces itself quietly. The men here weren't nervous amateurs. They were professionals. When professionals went silent, it meant they were thinking about consequences, or about killing someone. Across the table, one man looked especially out of place, not because he didn't belong, but because he refused to settle into the rhythm of the room. His jaw was tight, his eyes restless, his posture rigid, like a coiled spring. He had never liked meetings, never liked rules. He believed power came from fear, not agreement, and tonight he was carrying more pressure than he could hide. The commission existed to prevent chaos like this, to stop personal desperation from dragging everyone else down with it. But systems only work when the people inside them accept the rules, and not everyone did. Lucky leaned back slightly, listening. He wasn't here to dominate the room. He was here to read it, to feel where it was going before it got there. He had survived too many close calls to miss the signs now. Raised tension, unspoken resentment, a meeting that felt more like a confrontation waiting to happen. Every man in that suite knew the stakes. One wrong decision could bring law enforcement crashing down on all of them. One emotional outburst could start a war that would never end. That's why they'd built this system in the first place. But that night, the system was about to be tested, not by outsiders, not by the police, by one of their own. As the discussion edged closer to its true purpose, the room seemed to shrink. The walls felt tighter, the silence heavier. No one said it out loud, but everyone sensed it. By the end of this night, something fundamental would change. Either the commission would prove it was stronger than the men inside it, or it would die in the same room it was created. And Lucky Luciano, calm in a room full of killers, would be at the center of it all. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, quietly, the way real danger always does. At first, it was just rumors, a prosecutor who didn't return calls, judges who suddenly stopped being flexible, witnesses who had been reliable for years now hesitated. Then came the indictments, carefully built, hard to escape, impossible to ignore. For decades, the old mafia world had relied on predictability. Cops could be paid, politicians could be leaned on, problems could be scared away. That understanding was the foundation of power. But by the mid-1930s, something had changed. The government had found a new weapon, not brute force, but patience. Follow the money, flip the accountants, build cases that didn't collapse when one witness disappeared. That weapon terrified the underworld. Because it didn't respect fear. Inside the commission room, everyone understood what this pressure meant. It wasn't just about one investigation or one indictment. It was about the future. Prison sentences weren't symbolic anymore. They were long, crushing. Long enough to erase a man's influence and scatter his people. Long enough to turn legends into footnotes. For most of the men at the table, this pressure was manageable. They had diversified, spread risk, learned to operate quietly. But for one man, the walls were closing in fast. His operations were loud, profitable, visible, and now exposed. In the old world, that kind of threat had only one answer: violence. If a prosecutor was getting too close, you scared him. If that didn't work, you removed him. It was crude, but it had worked for generations. Fear had always been enough. Fear had built empires, but the commission wasn't built on fear. It was built on restraint. Lucky Luciano understood that better than anyone. He had watched the old bosses tear New York apart over pride and tradition. He had seen how personal wars invited attention, and how attention killed business. The commission was his answer to that chaos. Rules instead of impulse. Votes instead of vendettas. Survival through discipline. To Lucky, killing a prosecutor wasn't strength. It was self-destruction. That belief put him on the opposite side of the room from men who still lived by older rules. Men who believed hesitation was weakness. Men who believed that if fear stopped working, then nothing worked. As the pressure increased, so did the divide. Every argument for patience sounded like surrender. Every reminder of consequences felt like betrayal. The old world had been built on the idea that power meant control over life and death. Now, that control was slipping away, replaced by courtrooms and evidence and time. Time was the real enemy. The men who thrived under the old system had never needed it. They solved problems quickly, decisively. But this new pressure demanded waiting, planning, accepting limits. And for men who had never accepted limits, that was unbearable. Inside that room, the pressure wasn't just legal. It was existential. If violence was no longer an option, then the old way of ruling meant nothing. The commission represented the future, whether they liked it or not. A future where survival depended on cooperation, not intimidation. That realization broke something, not in the room as a whole, but in one man who could feel his world collapsing. The pressure didn't just threaten his freedom, it threatened his identity. Everything he believed about power was being challenged by a system that refused to panic. That's what made this night dangerous. Not the prosecutor, not the law, but the moment when the old world realized it no longer controlled the rules and that someone else did. The rules of the commission had never been tested like this. On paper, they were simple. No impulsive violence, no personal wars, no actions that brought heat down on everyone. Disputes were settled with discussion and votes, not bullets. It sounded clean, civilized, almost impossible in a world built on blood. That night, those rules faced their first real enemy. The proposal didn't come wrapped in diplomacy. It came blunt and final. Eliminate the threat, kill the prosecutor, end the problem before it destroyed everything. To the man proposing it, this wasn't recklessness. It was survival. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had solved problems the same way his entire life. The room reacted immediately, though no one shouted. Bodies shifted. Cigars paused midair. Eyes hardened. Everyone understood what was being suggested, and everyone understood the cost. Killing a public figure wasn't just another hit. It was a declaration of war against the entire system outside those walls. Lucky Luciano listened without interrupting. He didn't argue from emotion. He never did. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost disappointingly reasonable. He didn't talk about honor or fear. He talked about consequences, about attention, about how one violent act could bring federal pressure that never went away. He asked a simple question. What happens after? The answer was silence. Others began to speak, one by one. Not loudly, not dramatically. They supported Lucky's logic. This wasn't about protecting a prosecutor. It was about protecting the organization. The commission wasn't designed to save individual men from their own desperation. It was designed to ensure the survival of everyone else. That was when the divide became impossible to ignore. On one side were men who believed the future depended on restraint. On the other was a man who believed restraint was a death sentence. To him, the argument sounded like abandonment, while his freedom was slipping away. Everyone else wanted patience, discussion, time. Time was the one thing he didn't have. Lucky raised his hand to bring the room back to order. This wasn't personal, it was procedure. That was the entire point of the commission. No shouting, no threats, decisions made collectively. He called for a vote. For a moment, the room was completely still. This was authority speaking. Not fear, not reputation. Authority built on agreement. One by one, hands went up. The result was devastating. The proposal was rejected by an overwhelming majority. The rules stood. The system had spoken. For a brief second, it looked like the commission had worked exactly as intended. Then, a chair scraped back violently, breaking the illusion. The man who had lost the vote stood up fast, his face flushed, disbelief hardening into anger. This wasn't just disagreement. This was humiliation. He cursed the rules, mocked the idea of votes, accused Lucky of forgetting what this life was really built on. Blood, not ballots. Fear, not discussion. His voice cut through the room, sharp and dangerous. Lucky stayed seated. That was what changed everything. He didn't match the anger. He didn't rise to the challenge. He simply reminded him of the vote. 11-1. The decision was final. This was how things worked now. That sentence landed like a slap, because it made something clear that could no longer be ignored. The rules weren't suggestions anymore. They were authority, and authority no longer belonged to the loudest man in the room. That was the moment the rules were truly tested. Not by debate, not by disagreement, but by refusal. Hands drifted closer to jackets, eyes locked across the table. Every man there understood the danger. When someone openly rejects the system, there are only two outcomes. Either the system breaks, or the man does. And as the tension tightened, it became clear which one was about to be tested next. The moment the hand went inside the jacket, the room stopped breathing. Every man there recognized the movement instantly. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't debate. It was the final step between words and blood. A 45 automatic came out slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself demanded respect. The metal caught the light. The sound of the hammer being cocked was sharp and unmistakable, slicing through the silence like a blade. The gun was raised, steady, and aimed directly at Lucky Luciano's head. 3 feet. That was the distance between life and death. Point-blank range, no cover, no warning, no second chances. No one moved. Not because they were frozen in fear, but because they understood the math. 12 armed men in a closed room. One gunshot would trigger chaos. If anyone reached for a weapon, the commission would collapse into a slaughterhouse. No winners, only bodies. Lucky Luciano didn't move either. He didn't lean back in his chair. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't flinch. He sat exactly where he was, calm, composed, eyes locked on the man holding the gun. To anyone watching, it didn't look brave. It looked controlled, as if Lucky understood something the gunman didn't. The silence stretched. Seconds felt longer than minutes. Sweat beaded on foreheads. Cigars burned down unnoticed. Every man in that room knew they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about for decades, if anyone lived to talk about it. The gunman's finger rested on the trigger. His breathing was heavy now, measured, fighting to stay steady. This wasn't a bluff. This was a challenge to everything Lucky had built. A declaration that fear still ruled, that rules meant nothing when a man decided they didn't apply to him. Still, Lucky didn't blink. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, calm. almost conversational, not the voice of a man begging for his life, not the voice of a man threatening revenge. It was the voice of someone stating a fact. "You pull that trigger," Lucky said, "and you better kill every man in this room." The words landed hard. For the first time since the gun was raised, doubt flickered. Just for a moment. But everyone saw it. Lucky continued, his tone unchanged, explaining what would happen next. Killing him wouldn't end anything. It wouldn't restore power. It wouldn't solve the problem. It would create 11 enemies, 11 families, 11 organizations, with endless money, endless soldiers, and endless time. "You're not killing a boss," Lucky said. "You're killing the system." That was the sentence. The one that changed the equation. Because it forced the truth into the open. Even if the trigger was pulled, the outcome was already decided. The commission wouldn't die with Lucky. It would harden, and the man holding the gun would spend whatever life he had left running, hiding, waiting to be found. The realization hit slowly, painfully. The gun began to shake slightly. Not from fear, but from understanding. No one spoke. No one needed to. The balance of power had shifted without a single shot fired. What had once been ruled by impulse was now governed by inevitability. After what felt like an eternity, the gun lowered. It didn't slam back into the jacket. It didn't disappear in anger. It simply dropped, heavy and useless, before being put away. The rage drained from the gunman's face, replaced by something hollow. Lucky Luciano hadn't moved an inch. 3 feet from death, he proved something that no act of violence ever could. Power didn't belong to the man holding the gun. It belonged to the man who didn't need one. The gun went away, but nothing returned to normal. The room was quieter now, not with tension, but with understanding. Every man sitting at that table knew they had just crossed a threshold. They hadn't simply avoided violence. They had witnessed a transfer of power that didn't involve blood, shouting, or fear. Power had shifted without a single shot being fired. The man who had raised the gun stood still for a moment, looking around the room. What he saw wasn't sympathy. It wasn't fear either. It was isolation. In that silence, the truth became impossible to escape. He wasn't being protected by his reputation anymore. He wasn't being followed. The system he had challenged had closed ranks without saying a word. When he finally turned and walked toward the door, no one stopped him. No one spoke. That was deliberate. He wasn't being chased out. He was being left behind. And that was far worse. Lucky Luciano stayed seated. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look relieved. He looked exactly the same as he had when the gun was aimed at his head. Calm, controlled, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. That was the moment the Mafia realized something fundamental about him. Lucky wasn't untouchable because no one could kill him. He was untouchable because killing him wouldn't change anything. That was the power he had built. The commission meeting ended quietly. Men stood, adjusted their coats, and filed out without conversation. But the silence carried meaning. Everyone understood that the system had just proven itself, not in theory, not on paper, in the most dangerous way possible. Soon after, consequences followed. Quietly, efficiently. The man who had challenged the rules didn't survive long in a world that no longer tolerated instability. The commission never announced anything. It didn't need to. Authority didn't shout. It acted. From that night forward, organized crime was different. Decisions weren't made by whoever was angriest or loudest. They were made by agreement, by structure, by rules that everyone understood would be enforced. Violence didn't disappear, but it became controlled, purposeful, rare. That restraint made the Mafia stronger. Lucky Luciano's greatest achievement wasn't surviving that night. It was what came after. The proof that the organization could outlive its leaders, that no single man could hold it hostage with a gun or a tantrum. Even when Lucky himself later went to prison, the system didn't collapse. Meetings continued. Votes were taken. The commission functioned exactly as it was designed to. That was untouchable. Not a man who couldn't be harmed, but a man whose removal wouldn't undo what he built. The irony was brutal. The very moment someone tried to challenge Lucky with violence became the moment his authority was cemented forever. He didn't win by pulling a trigger. He didn't win by ordering a hit. He won by understanding something deeper. Fear creates obedience. Structure creates survival. That night, the Mafia learned the difference. Lucky Luciano walked out of that moment alive, not because no one dared to kill him, but because killing him no longer mattered. The system would go on, the rules would stand, and anyone who couldn't accept that future would be removed by it. That is what it meant to be untouchable. Not immortal. Inevitable.